Hi, Student Success. This is your Chapter 4 lecture video. So I'm going to go ahead and get into the materials folder. I'm going to have the Chapter 4 textbook link up and going, just in case we want to visit this, but I'm going to rely mostly upon the slideshow. And then I'm going to show you a couple other quick little resources that you could utilize to help you with this content as well. So I am looking at the slideshow right here. I just downloaded it and have it in the tab next to me. So this chapter is about listening, taking notes, and remembering. Honestly, these are like such key pieces of being a student in general, not even higher education, just K through 12 and lifelong learning. So it's really important to, I don't want to say master these skills, because I think there's always room to grow or adapt in all of these, but it's definitely skills that we need to focus and hone. So first thing, the big thing that Chapter 4 wants to hit on is that college is different from high school. We've talked about this already previously, and there's a lot of self-responsibility for your learning. In particular, if you are taking an online class, it is incredibly on your shoulders to be able to take the information. Time management is very important when you are studying and taking notes and in all of these pieces and in the big picture in general. And then this chapter does talk about learning as a cycle in these 4 different steps. And so we'll talk about those as well. All right. So part of this process, listening, taking notes, and remembering actually starts before we even get in the classroom. So mentally, there are some things that you could be doing to make sure that you are ready to take notes, that you're ready to listen, that your memory is kind of as sharp as it can be. Thinking of some goals. What do you want to get out of the class? That could be big picture, at the end of this class, what do I hope to get out of it? It could be an A, but that means you'd have to master material, but can also be skills or things like of that nature. And then you can also bring it down to small, very short-term focus. What do I want to get out of today's class? And then thinking about what is the main idea the class will cover, and then how will it help me overall with the whole class? So just mentally thinking through and preparing yourself. Physically, there are things you could be doing as well when you get to class, making sure that you're taking care of yourself. These are sometimes easier said than done. A lot of sleep and eating right is going to help you with your focus. Make sure you have all your materials. I know this sounds like common sense. However, I've been teaching for a long time, and this happens quite a bit where I have students who show up to a physical classroom with absolutely nothing. And, it's not the first day of class. It's like middle of the semester. They just don't have anything. And I understand that happens every once in a while, but we don't want to make a pattern of that. Make sure you have your materials. Give yourself time to get to class. Get your space ready so that you're not feeling rushed or out of sorts. I know for many people, if you're rushing, you get there late, you feel like you have to play catch up and you're not quite sure what's happening. So give yourself that time. And then make sure all the other distractions are put away. Tuck your phone away if you need to, flip it over, put it in your bag. If you are a doodler and it helps you focus, that's fine. I have students who doodle because that helps them actually focus. Other times students doodle because it's distracting. So know what your distractors are and make sure that you attend to those so that they are not going to get in the way of your learning. Whenever you are listening in a lecture space, now this could be both physically in a classroom or you are at home listening to a lecture. You want to have your mind space right, which we alluded to in the last slide. Make sure that you're prepared to receive the information. And review your notes before. So if you are covering Chapter 4 in your class right now, oftentimes in many classes, not every class, but in many classes, you'll have a lecture that is built upon the previous lecture or the previous chapter. So maybe reviewing your notes and just understanding how it's connected. Get in the right space. So if you're in a physical classroom, I know it's uncomfortable, but sitting toward the front of the room is helpful because you're making eye contact and it's more difficult to zone out, not impossible, but more difficult to zone out when you're sitting close. Now, if you're in, your home or the library or wherever, that's also important to have the right physical space, an academic space in your home, place in the library where it's quiet and not distracting. Focus on what's being said. So again, get rid of those distractions. If you know that sitting near the window in a classroom is going to distract you because you're going to look out the window and daydream, sit away from the window. Make sure that you are really in tune, know who you are as a learner so that you are setting yourself up for focused time in the classroom. Try to keep your mind as quiet and calm as possible, which again, easier said than done. But what I like to do before I read or I head into a class, because I am one of those that my mind goes everywhere, I get out a Post-it or a piece of paper and I just jot down some things that I need to think about or do after my study time or after my class time. That way I'm not like mentally running through a list of things, or I'm distracted by what was all coming up or expected of me later in the day. It's also important to kind of close out tabs of anything that's not class related, so you're not tempted to click over to them, and even better self-control to not open them to begin with. Whenever you are listening, listen for things that the instructor repeats or goes over multiple times, their voice raises or lowers. Sometimes they write ideas on the board. Those are all cues that we need to be listening to this more closely even. Here are some other tips when we are listening inside a lecture space. Look for what's not being said. This is actually really important. This also necessitates the fact that one of those hidden rules of college, the hidden curriculum, is that you should be reading the lecture that the chapter is being covered before you step into that classroom. So again, for instance, let's say on Wednesday, your instructor is covering chapter 4. You should read chapter 4 before Wednesday. That way you're already familiar. You're setting yourself up for some solid foundational learning, some prior knowledge, but you also can see what is not making sense. And then you can pay attention to what is not being covered. So if the instructor is not covering a certain section, that gives you a signal like, hey, in this class, in their view, this is not quite as important. Which leads to sorting the information. What is important? What is not so important? During the lecture, pay attention once again from the last slide. What did they write on the board? What are they emphasizing? What are they focusing on? You want to take notes. Now, I am of the belief that notes are not 100% necessary every single situation. The reason I say that is because some students learn differently. And so if you are a visual or an auditory learner, you may be really relying on listening to the lecture and jotting down minimal notes. Now, if you're a read-write learner, like you like to see text, you're probably going to be writing quite a bit of notes. Notes definitely are valuable, but you want to make sure that you're using them appropriately and that fits your needs. So you want to find the right note-taking method, and that's coming up soon as well. One of the most important things you can do is ask questions. So asking questions is not only helpful for you, it's helpful for other classmates, and it's helpful for the instructor. Because think about it, if the instructor is getting asked a question and several students have that question, that can be something they know that they need to learn how to incorporate or adapt when they talk about that topic. Also, some students are really nervous about asking questions in front of other students. Send an email, stay after class, but please just ask the question. Recording lectures. Now, some instructors are a little picky about this just based on the content of their course, but recording could actually lead you to listen more actively. It just depends how you use the recording. Some students will allow themselves to record because they know they're not going to catch everything while they take notes. So the recording becomes kind of like a fail-safe, a backup. So you always want to ask permission first, because some instructors are okay with it, others are not. But recording, as long as you're using it because you know you're going to go back and re-listen, it can be very effective. If you're recording just because you're like, oh, just to have it, you might zone out more and with no intent to listen to it later. So just make sure you're using it with the right intent. All right, some little tips, like some things that you want to do if your instructor speaks too fast. I'll be honest, maybe you can already tell, I tend to be a quick talker. And so this is important to, in these situations, know the information before you come into class. Read it so that you're prepared, so that maybe you don't feel like you're trying to race to catch up. See if any other students are having the same issue. Work together to kind of fill in any notes or questions, and then talk to the instructor. 9 times out of 10, maybe 10 times out of 10, most instructors are willing to take that feedback. Like, you know what? I didn't realize I was doing that, so that they can both slow down, but also clarify anything you have missed. If you have a hard time understanding your instructor, because we all have different backgrounds, sit close, make connections, ask questions, again, talk to the instructor. If they speak softly, again, hold eye contact, sit close, talk to the instructor. So hopefully you see a theme here that communication is extremely important. Now, we've talked about some listening. Part of the listening process often does involve note-taking. So note-taking is important because it does all of these things and more. It does support your listening. It allows you to kind of like self-test. You can go back and look at your notes and see, what did you understand? What did you not understand? And there is a very strong connection between reading, writing, and memory. And so if you are writing the material down, reading it over, you're more likely to recall it. It also allows you to really think through what the instructor thinks is important, and it does create that study guide as long as you are filling it in and making sure you're visiting your notes again after the class. In your textbook, there are different note-taking methods, and so this is where I will kind of come here. As always, you have like your beginning of the chapter check-in and some goal setting, things like are going to have you just kind of reflect. Then it's going to go through the differences between high school and college. This is also another theme. We've talked about this already. We know that there are differences between the two, and how you approach work and making sure that you are addressing issues as a college student, not the mentality of a high school student. This section talks about the learning cycle that was mentioned on the first slide, preparing, absorbing, recording, reviewing information. So I'm going to come back to that here in just a little bit. This is the, preparing for class, listening. I'm going to keep scrolling. And then we're going to get to the note-taking section. So here is a nice little table here that talks about different note-taking methods. And there are more than just this, of course, but this kind of outlines some of the more common ones and when it's appropriate to use them. So here they have it kind of minimized, but you can see it be a little better right here. So we do listing. Now listing is okay depending on the circumstance. It's often used for small amounts of information. If you haven't learned other methods, it's a lot of writing if you're not concise or thinking about really the main points. But honestly, most of the time lists are least effective, or linear writing where you're just writing lines of information in paragraphs. Those aren't very effective because you don't have a structure to them. Now outline has a structure to it. You probably are familiar with outlining. Whenever you have written an essay or a speech, you have to have an outline. Sometimes the instructor requires it. This is also a note-taking strategy. So if you like structure and seeing things organized in this way, this is a very helpful method. So outlining is great when it's well organized, and you can also type an outline pretty quickly and easily. Concept map, this is great if you are a visual learner. Concept maps are usually not a lot of text, so you can see this is kind of like a herringbone, but there's also bubble maps, and honestly a concept map can take on a lot of different forms. The key is it's visual, and so you're connecting ideas and showing relationships, but you're not doing a ton of writing. You can see there's keywords and phrases here, so it's not meant for a ton of writing. And so I often see this in some science classes or some math classes or things. So there's definitely great situations to use concept mapping. And then finally, Cornell notes. This was developed at Cornell University, and it was really aimed for students who struggle with organizing their notes. And you are going to see this in some of your work for the work that's associated with chapter 4. Cornell notes, you have a left column and a right column. On the left-hand column, you have a concept, a term, an idea. On the right-hand side, you go into more details on that concept, term, or idea. So you would maybe have a vocabulary word over here. It would just be one word or small phrase. On the right-hand side, then you would define it. And then at the bottom of Cornell notes, there's typically space for you to summarize or recap some of the key points. Again, Cornell notes is great because it really does organize your thinking. It allows you to look at how ideas are connected in terms of maybe there's a main idea and supporting details, or a word and its definition. And it also sets up a very nice study guide. You can kind of use that to quiz yourself. And so they talk more about Cornell notes here as well. You can see there's a lot of information. And then they have some general note-taking tips underneath, which we will look at right now. So some note-taking tips. Be prepared. This is kind of what I talked about before. Know your syllabus, know what's coming up, read ahead of time. This says write on only one side of the paper. Some people prefer that. I honestly don't. I write on both sides. Label. This was something that I didn't really think was important until I was a couple weeks into my undergrad experience. Really label every time you take notes. The chapter, the date, maybe the concepts. It's nice to go back and be able to quickly see what each page is covering. If you're using a laptop, make sure you just position yourself accurately so you can see everything. This is another mistake a lot of students make. Don't capture everything that is said. It's really almost just as ineffective as writing nothing is writing too much. You want to pull out the main ideas and not worry about writing word for word, because you almost never need something word for word. In fact, whenever you can put things into your own words, that's when it's most meaningful and relevant. This is what we already talked about. Look at what they're putting on the board. Leave some space if you need to go back and add anything. Develop a shorthand. Kind of develop your own way to think about questions, separate from maybe what the textbook or the author is saying. Create a symbol if you need to go back and be like, oh, this is really something I need to pick at later, or I need to ask about. Review your notes within 24 hours if you can, because that's when they're fresh. You can go back and think, oh, you know what? I remember now this section. I need to go back and look in the book and fill in my notes this way. And then this is what I alluded to already. Learning has the most meaning when we can put it into our own words. If we can regurgitate an author, well, cool, we can remember things, but that's the author's words. We want to put it on our words because we're the ones who have to understand it for class, a test, a paper, whatever it might be. So put that information in your own words in a summary. What if you miss class whenever you are taking notes? So see if there's another section. Oftentimes instructors will teach the same class, Monday, Wednesday, and then they'll teach it Tuesday, Thursday. If you have the time, see if you can sit in, because often they're covering similar things on the same timeline. Look to see if they post lecture notes or like recordings. Check in with the classmates, see if you can borrow notes. Look at the course syllabus, and of course, again, talk to your instructor. All right, the memory piece, making sure that you are taking information from your working, like your short-term memory, over to long-term memory, which is ideal. Make sure that you are being very thoughtful and deliberate about whatever it is you're trying to remember. Make connections to your everyday life. If we can make something meaningful to us through an example, through some kind of little situation or story, it's going to be easier for us to remember. Link it to information you already have stored. So this is where you'll hear sometimes people say, like, activate your prior knowledge. Think about what you already know about this topic, and then you can build upon that. That builds knowledge networks, and it helps you remember information easily. Try to put things into buckets or clusters or whatever word you want to use there. Group ideas together, because it's easier to remember things when they are maybe themed together. There's it's called picture superiority effect, is basically what this is saying. Use visual imagery. This phenomenon of visual superiority effect says that we are more likely to remember something if we can associate both words and a picture in our head to it. If we can connect those things together, we're more likely to remember it. Use the information. We honestly have the capability, for the most part, to remember information forever. The problem is, if we learn something and we work on converting it to long-term memory, and then we don't think about it again for weeks or months or years, it just gets buried. We can no longer retrieve it. So it's not necessarily an issue of remembering, it's an issue of retrieving that information, getting it back out. Break information down into chunks. So whenever I'm teaching my students and talking about like reading strategies, I'm always going to advise, like, we do not want to read a chapter all the way through. We want to break it into sections. We want to even maybe break it into pages, whatever, to make sure we're not overdoing it. So we have more ability to not get overwhelmed, but also then remember certain pieces. If it helps you work from general to specific, eliminate distractions. That is a common theme. Repeat. The more repetition, the easier it is to remember something. Think about your elementary education days where you had to write your spelling words 3 times each, or whatever the case is. Repetition does help. You want to connect it with other things, but repetition is a great place to start. This is a test. Okay, so that means the testing effect. If you can practice testing, retrieving information, so coming up with a practice test, studying with others, flashcards, kind of quizzing yourself, that is a great way to practice retrieving information from your long-term memory. Location has to do with a couple of things. Making sure that first you're in a physical and mental space to remember the information. But then also, how are you storing the information? Like, where in your mind, I know that sounds a little odd, but where in your mind are you storing it? How are you going to file it? So that goes back to like linking information to what you already know and what you already have stored, coming up with clusters or themes. So thinking about how you are putting that information all together. All right, so I told you I would kind of come back to this learning cycle because that's the only thing that our slides really don't address a ton. I want you to just kind of think about learning as it is in a cycle. We want to make sure that we're preparing to learn. So taking time the day or days leading up to what we're about to read or sit and listen to, and really think about how our preparation is. Absorb those new ideas. So activate your listening, really making sure that you are giving that speaker your attention, you're not distracted. Find your note-taking method that works best for you, and then review. So this is something that has appeared in a previous chapter, right? Chapter 1. But I wanted to make sure I reference it again here because it ties in all of these concepts from this chapter. So again, I encourage you to take a look through the chapter itself, especially if you're like, man, I really struggle with note-taking, or I struggle with listening or memory, or all three. Really hone in on the sections that you feel like you need the most assistance with, or that you need to brush up on, or you're like, hey, I've never heard about Cornell notes. Let me find out a little bit more. You also have in your materials folder, you have some note-taking app links. You can certainly visit this website and see, what are the best note-taking apps. If you are an app user for notes, there's kind of mixed reviews on that. A lot of people actually prefer to do like the typical paper pencil note taking, but if you're an app person, there's a link there. If you need a little bit more information on becoming a better listener, there's information there. You can watch that video. It links you to a different site to give you tips on better listening. And then I know this seems kind of out of there, but there's a link to the clubs and organizations. We've already discussed that a little bit. All right. If you have any questions on the content from this chapter or need more assistance with any of this, please let me know. And then your assignments associated with chapter 4 will have you practicing some of these concepts. See you next time.